The door stood open, yet the key was gone. Welcome to Mind Night Detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Your voices make these mysteries unforgettable. Let's begin. It was in the gentler decline of an autumn afternoon that I found myself by the river again, where the Cherwell slackens its breath and carries the pale sky on its back. The leaves had begun their quiet surrender, falling in languid spirals to the water's surface, each one a fragment of some forgotten epilogue. I was not there for beauty, though beauty has a way of intruding upon the business of crime. I had come to meet Lewis near Magdalen Bridge, but he was late, and lateness, I have found, lends itself to unwelcome reflection. I watched the rowers as they leaned into their rhythm, faces pinched, bodies taut with effort, all of them striving for a finish line that exists only in memory once it is past. It seemed to me an apt metaphor for most lives I had observed in Oxford. Learned, disciplined, and curiously futile. Lewis arrived at last, apologetic, his breath betraying a recent cigarette. He told me, in that understated way of his, that a body had been found on the towpath not far from Parsons' Pleasure. A don, he believed, though he had not yet caught the name. The police had closed the scene, and he suggested I might care to walk down. I said very little. I rarely need to say much. People will fill silence with what they most wish me to know. As we crossed beneath the overhanging branches, I thought of a crossword clue I had abandoned that morning. The scholar with broken heart confined by river. 6. I had written nothing in, distracted as ever by the trivial business of death. Yet as Lewis spoke, I realized the answer. Don to D +on, scholar. A river enclosing a wound. It was an inelegant clue, but then life itself is rarely an elegant setter. The constable guarding the path stood awkwardly, as though embarrassed by the intrusion of mortality into such an otherwise picturesque evening. The victim lay on his side, half obscured by the gathering dusk, one arm outstretched toward the water, as if he had intended to write something upon its surface. His hair, silvered with age, caught the last of the sun in thin strands. Beside him, a book rested face down in the mud. I crouched and examined it without touching. A library label clung stubbornly to the spine, though the title had blurred with damp. I thought it was Greek. I felt a faint tightening in my chest. Books have their own afterlife, and the company they keep at the hour of a man's death is rarely accidental. Lewis muttered something about robbery, though his tone was unpersuaded. The wallet was gone, certainly, but there was an oddness in the posture of the hand, the way the fingers pressed faintly into the earth as though seeking purchase. I said to him that robbery is a blunt motive, and Oxford crimes are rarely blunt. He did not answer, but his silence carried the weight of reluctant agreement. The coroner's van pulled up, its doors sighing open, and men in dark coats lifted the body with a practised gentleness. For a moment the face turned toward me. It was lined not just with years, but with the kind of solitude that no company quite dispels. I had seen it too often before. In that expression lay the mystery, not of how he died, but of how he had lived unseen, until death made him visible. We walked back slowly, the lamps along the high street beginning to flicker into life. The air smelt faintly of wet stone and petrol fumes. Students laughed outside the White Horse, and the bells of Magdalen tolled as if for no one in particular. Lewis asked if I thought the book mattered. I said it always matters. He gave a small shrug, which I pretended not to notice. Later, alone in my rooms, I poured a measure of whiskey and considered the clue once more. Scholar with broken heart confined by river. 6 letters. I had written it down, but the word stared back emptily. Don, scholar, but also loss, hidden inside water and silence. I let the pencil rest upon the desk and watched the light fade beyond the curtains. Some evenings resist conclusion. There are rooms one remembers not for their furnishings, but for the silence they leave behind. I stepped into the study of the deceased that evening with the faint unease of a trespasser, though the constable at the door assured me of my right to be there. Dust clung to the air, disturbed only by the movement of our feet across a floor polished more by habit than care. The curtains had been drawn hastily. A thin shaft of lamplight revealed the litter of a life half-lived and abruptly halted. Lewis remarked that it looked like a burglary, though I caught hesitation in his voice. Books were pulled from shelves, spines cracked open, papers scattered across the carpet in a chaos too performative to convince. Burglars rarely trouble themselves with the finer points of philology. Yet here, dictionaries lay face down beside volumes of Herodotus. A page from one notebook had been torn, not clumsily, but with a deliberation that suggested knowledge of what was worth excising. He asked me if I thought it staged. I told him that disorder has its own syntax, and that this particular arrangement lacked grammar. He gave me a quizzical look, to which I offered no translation. The room smelt faintly of tobacco, though no ashtray was in sight. An odd thing that. Scholars smoke with persistence, and the absence of stubbed-out evidence troubled me. On the mantelpiece stood a row of postcards. Venice, Vienna, a faded Oxford postcard of Magdalen Tower. They were arranged not by date, but by hue, forming a subtle gradation from the brightest to the palest. Such fastidiousness jarred against the wreckage of the desk. I knelt to examine a fallen chessboard. The pieces lay scattered, but 2 pawns had been placed upright, side by side, in an otherwise empty square. No burglar would waste his time with such trifles. I wondered if the arrangement meant something, or whether grief was already making me too credulous of patterns. Lewis bent down and asked if I played. Occasionally, I said, but only against myself. He seemed uncertain whether I was serious. On the desk, I found a sheet of paper with half a crossword completed in a tight, angular hand. The clue that arrested me was 12 down. Confession concealed in ruin 5. No answer filled the boxes. I muttered softly to myself. Anagram of in ruin. I-N-R-U-I. Ruin concealing confession. I wrote ruin in my mind, turned it over, and found inurn. A burial, a sealing away. The kind of answer that lingers beyond the puzzle itself. I felt then that this was no accident of the victim's unfinished hour, but a whisper left behind for whomever might care to listen. Lewis noted that the bed had not been slept in. The coverlet was smooth, corners tucked with a care that belongs more to hotel maids than solitary dons. I told him to check the laundry basket. Empty. A man does not go a week without so much as a shirt discarded, unless his days have been severed midway. As we prepared to leave, I noticed a narrow wardrobe ajar, its mirror reflecting our bent figures with an accusatory slant. Inside hung a series of dark suits, identical in cut, the kind that erases individuality rather than proclaims it. At the bottom, a pair of shoes still bore the damp imprint of a walk along the riverbank. I touched the leather and felt the chill of evening water. On the way out, Lewis asked what I made of it all. That someone had been searching, yes, but not for valuables. That the room had been left in disorder to conceal a more careful extraction. He pressed me to say what had been taken. I told him that absence is harder to catalogue than presence. He frowned, muttering something about always speaking in riddles. Perhaps I do, but riddles, like lives, have their own reticence. We closed the door behind us, and I heard the click echo down the corridor like a punctuation mark on an unfinished sentence. Outside, the rain had begun, pattering against stone, seeping into the gaps where mortar yields to time. The lamps along Holywell Street glowed faintly, halos blurred by mist. Students hurried past with books shielded beneath coats, laughter rising despite the hour. I envied them their certainty that the world still held more questions than answers. Back in my rooms later, I poured a whiskey and thought of that crossword clue again. Confession concealed in ruin. The word inern would not let me go. Something had been sealed, hidden away in those rooms, and whoever had taken it understood its weight. I sat with the thought until the glass was empty and the night closed in without conclusion. There is a particular chill in certain college halls that owes nothing to weather. It rises from stone, handled by ceremony, from benches that have endured appetite and ambition, from portraits that sip the light like grudging port. I took my place at high table not as a guest, and not quite as an intruder. The master had urged me to observe. Observe is an obliging verb in Oxford. It keeps one fed while pretending to fast. Lewis sat below with the junior commoners, content there. He glanced up, received my nod, and returned to eating. Around me, the hierarchy assembled with the practised grace of a madrigal. Bursar, chaplain, librarian, 2 historians with the dryness of parchment, and an economist who smiled like a man prosecuting a private experiment. I asked for the bell at the old time. The porter obliged. Sound climbed the hammer-beam roof and fell in a slow shower. Habit reveals where guilt nests. The innocent hear noise, the anxious a summons. One historian touched his tie as if checking his throat. The librarian folded her hands with the meekness of someone who has learned to occupy less space than her mind requires. Grace was said in Latin. Nobody claimed to understand. I noted the chaplain's hesitation before Miserere. An odd place to pause, unless supplication had lately become personal. They fed us duck, overcooked to the college standard, and a tart whose crust opposed teeth. Conversation kept to guarded lanes, the art of institutions that never quite arrive. The bursar told me, with the coyness of a man gossiping to his conscience, that the dead man had questioned endowments. He did not specify the questions. He nodded towards the economist and murmured that transparency was fashionable fog. Student representatives had been invited as democratic mist. One young woman, a faint scar at the corner of her mouth, addressed me without deference. Did the police think the river had offered an accident? Rivers, I said, are rarely altruists. She smiled. I suspected it was the nearest she allowed to laughter. Coffee came, and with it the rustle of chairs pushed back by men who have mastered the small tyranny of furniture. Beneath the table a napkin lay folded into a rough cylinder. On it a damp patch shaped like a timid leaf. I thought of the library book rescued from the river, of shoes that had remembered water. Some stains are itinerant. They travel with their keeper. The librarian asked if I solved crosswords in pen. Only when I trust the setter, I said. She inclined her head as if confessing that trust was expensive, and polished her spectacles with a corner of the tablecloth already consigned to indignity. Her sleeve carried a brown tide mark where cotton had dried imperfectly. Rain, perhaps, or the recalcitrant percolator in the senior common room. The historian who had touched his tie now polished his signet ring and watched his reflection tremble. He admitted he had lunched with the deceased to discuss an obscure grant. Obscurity, I said, is rarely innocent in finance. The bursar bristled and smoothed himself like a man who knows money dislikes sudden movements. Dessert plates were cleared. The chaplain rose and excused himself with an apology that bowed to nobody in particular. I watched his step. He favoured the left leg, yet earlier he had reached instinctively for the salt with the same hand. A natural left-hander does not hesitate with a cruet. Pain explains many betrayals of grace, but not the choreography of habit. As the company thinned, Lewis appeared with the shy impatience he reserves for rooms scented with polish. The porter had found a torn envelope in the pigeonholes, addressed to the dead man in a tidy female hand. The college crest pressed deeper than tasteful. Postmark from Jericho. Keep it, I told him, and do not read it yet. Anticipation, like whiskey, should not be gulped. Before leaving, I visited the portraits. Their eyes had practiced endurance, and were not dazzled by tragedy. In a corner hung a benefactor who once financed the choir, and later forgot the debt. He had been remembered anyway. This city excels at accounting without numbers. Outside, the quad held the night like a chalice too cold for lips. Rain began, thin and continuous, a line drawn by an undemonstrative hand. I told Lewis our table had hosted 3 silences: fear, calculation, and sorrow. Which was which? I said I would tell him when I was sure. I am rarely sure. Certainty makes poor company on long walks. Back in my rooms, I opened the paper and found a light crossword. 17 down. Bent Grace around confession, initially. For a meal's end treat, 7 letters. I rearranged Grace, set C for confession, and saw caramels. Childish, yes. Still, it reminded me that sweetness often arrives by misdirection, and that the end of a meal is seldom the end of appetite. I let the rain sort the city into rooms again. The letter arrived folded in a way that betrayed more than one reader. Paper, after all, carries its own fatigue. Creases accumulate not from the first hand that writes, but from the later hands that hesitate, smooth, and conceal. When Lewis handed it to me in my rooms, his eyes darted briefly to the whiskey on my desk, as though wondering whether I would pour before or after confession. It was a woman's hand, careful and rounded, the kind that resists haste even when urgency presses. Jericho postmark, faintly blurred. The salutation was formal, but the phrasing betrayed intimacy long practiced. I read once, then set it down. Lewis asked if it meant anything. I told him not yet. He frowned and said it seemed plain enough. The woman had known the deceased well. Yes, I said, but plainness often masks its own embroidery. The first sentence spoke of regret, the kind unmoored from specifics. Regret for absence, regret for silence, regret for a dinner not attended. She apologized for words spoken too sharply at their last meeting, then lingered on an unnamed promise he had failed to keep. The lines bent with restraint, as though she feared each word might bruise. Lewis pressed again. Did I think she loved him? Love, I said, is a word best left in dictionaries. It pretends at definition and refuses it in practice. He sighed, muttered that I liked to make everything difficult. But difficulty is often the only path to truth. I poured us each a measure. We drank without toasting. Silence, like whiskey, warms differently depending on who shares it. When Lewis left, I unfolded the letter once more. A second reading often reveals the hesitations between words. On the back of the page, faint indentations suggested that she had begun another note, then torn it away. My pencil shaded lightly across the surface, until ghostly letters emerged. An unfinished phrase he will discover, followed by nothing but paper whiteness. Discover what? A debt? A betrayal? Or merely her own reluctance? The unsaid is heavier than the said. I placed the letter beside the crossword I had abandoned earlier. 10 across, twice seen, truth concealed, 7. Palindrome, perhaps. I wrote down reviver, then crossed it out. Deified, still wrong. I stared at the half-filled grid and realized the setter was forcing repetition to signify distortion. A word read forwards and backwards loses clarity, not gains it. Much like letters, read twice, thrice, until meaning dissolves into interpretation. The rain returned, brushing the panes with a steady insistence. I recalled the librarian's sleeve, still marked with its drying tide. A coincidence, perhaps, but Jericho rain leaves its trace differently than the drizzle that clings to Broad Street. One begins to suspect that stains travel with their makers, not their weather. Near midnight I walked out into the quad. Lamps sputtered against the damp, moths circling hopelessly about the glow. I found myself rehearsing fragments of the letter aloud, as if their cadence might betray intention. Regret, promise, silence. Each word lingered like a slow toll of bells, deliberate and unresolved. I wondered whether he had read it twice himself, perhaps more, perhaps folded it back with the same care, slid it into a pocket, carried it to the river. Paper is patient, but it cannot resist water. Once wet, words blur into anonymity, leaving only the hand that wrote them. Back in my rooms, I poured the last of the bottle. Lewis had said plain enough, but no letter is ever plain once read again. On the second reading, I heard less of her voice and more of his absence. The shadows between her lines spoke louder than the ink. Some truths arrive not in what is written, but in what refuses to be named. I set the paper down, extinguished the lamp, and let the rain continue its monologue. There is a certain comfort in the false solution. It arrives with a persuasive elegance, neat enough to satisfy, flimsy enough to betray itself upon the second glance. That evening, Lewis believed we had reached the end. I did not share his conviction, though I lacked the cruelty to deny him outright. We sat in his office, the gas fire stuttering, papers arranged in hopeful sequence across his desk. He traced with his finger the line of argument, motive, opportunity, means. The librarian's sleeve, the torn letter, the obscure grant. It all pointed, he said, to one direction. He spoke with the steadiness of a man who prefers bricks to mist. I asked him whether he trusted conclusions that required such symmetry. He said it was not a question of trust, it was a question of fact. Yet even facts, I reminded him, are only the fragments we happen to catch. The rest is silence, and silence makes poor evidence. He sighed, rubbed his temple, and asked if I would always insist on riddles. Only until the riddle stops pretending to be truth, I said. The papers on his desk included a receipt from a Jericho cafe, dated 2 days before the body was found. The name scrawled at the bottom might have been hers, or anyone's. Lewis said it tied her to the deceased. I said it tied her to coffee. He looked at me as though I delighted in pedantry. Perhaps I do. Pedantry sometimes rescues us from haste. A crossword lay abandoned beside the papers. Lewis had been trying, with little success, to pass the time while waiting for reports. He pointed to one clue. 8 down. Answer not what it seems. 5. He had written truth in hesitant capitals. I told him he was wrong. The answer was sham. Truth satisfies the hopeful. Sham satisfies the setter. He shook his head, muttering that word games were a distraction. But distractions often sketch the outline of what the mind refuses to name. Later, I walked the streets alone. The rain had ended, leaving the stones slick and glistening as though freshly revealed. At the Bodleian, Lamps burned with the same endurance as old men reading newspapers in silence. I paused at the Radcliffe camera, its roundness glowing faintly under the moon. A circle has no corner in which to hide, and yet how easily it can conceal. The letter returned to me in thought. Twice read, thrice considered, it refused to settle. What had been meant by that unfinished phrase? He will discover. Discover betrayal? Discover affection? Or only discover that discovery itself is unbearable? The ambiguity weighed heavier than confession would have done. Lewis telephoned me near midnight. He said he had spoken to the bursar again, who insisted that the deceased had been about to expose mismanagement. There, Lewis said, was motive sufficient. I asked him whether the bursar had offered details, figures, names. He admitted he had not pressed. I told him that vagueness is a luxury the guilty often purchase cheaply. He grew quiet and for once did not argue. In my own rooms, I poured a whiskey and opened the crossword he had abandoned. 8 down still glared at me. Answer, not what it seems. Sham. Yes, a word that held both derision and defence. I wrote it in firmly. For the moment our solution seemed persuasive, even final. Yet my hand hesitated at the next clue. Lewis's conviction, the bursar's hint, the librarian's sleeve. They fit, just as sham fit neatly into the grid. But fit is not always truth. The satisfaction of a crossword comes too quickly. The true puzzle resists. I thought of the historian polishing his ring, of the chaplain's pause before miserere, of the economist's smile that concealed more than it revealed. Too many small silences still unsettled me. I extinguished the light and let the darkness take the room. A false solution is not without value. It teaches one to recognize the sound of certainty when certainty is counterfeit. Somewhere in the quiet, the true pattern waited, patient, as all truths are. There is something in libraries that amplifies silence, as though the air itself conspires to hush even private thought. I returned there the following morning, before the students had scattered themselves into the long tables, before the rustle of pages resumed its imitation of eternity. The light through the mullioned windows fell like thin parchment, cold and colourless. The librarian was waiting. She had written to me, or perhaps only meant me to notice the invitation contained in her sleeve's tide mark. That faint memory of water clinging to cotton. She led me past the catalogue desk, down into the narrow corridors where bindings lean upon each other like the elderly at vespers. She said little at first. I asked her how long she had known him. A pause, then a reply measured to the inch. Long enough to know he did not deserve what befell him. The phrasing was careful, as though truth and affection had quarrelled, and she could not side entirely with either. In her office, small, ordered, faintly scented with dust and polish, she unlocked a drawer. Inside lay a stack of slips, the pale blue borrowings from the closed stacks. She placed one in front of me. His name, the date, the title, a Greek text, Plato's Phaedo, a meditation on the soul's release. She said it had never been returned. Lewis, who had followed me in with his heavy patience, muttered that readers forget. She shook her head gently. He never forgot. That was the difficulty. I turned the slip in my hand. On the reverse side, someone had pressed too firmly with their pencil, leaving a shallow impress of words. I held it up to the light. A single phrase emerged. Truth will not wait. I asked her if she had written it. Her eyes did not shift, but the stillness around them betrayed an answer. She said only that the deceased had carried the book too close, as though it were not philosophy, but confession. Lewis asked her directly whether she had loved him. She did not answer, and the silence was more eloquent than any avowal. I noticed then a framed photograph on her shelf. The corners curled slightly with age. 3 figures. The deceased, younger, laughing without irony. The historian who had polished his ring with such agitation. And the librarian herself, standing slightly apart. I pointed to it. She said it had been taken in Crete during a conference. A sunlit island, and yet here the image lived in shadow. She began to explain that the deceased had been engaged in something dangerous to his reputation. I asked if it concerned money. No, she said softly, it concerned memory. He had kept notes, letters, records of conversations thought trivial by those who spoke them. He believed memory was the only defense against deceit. I asked her where these notes might be. Her gaze shifted to the locked drawer, then away again. Lewis leaned forward, impatient. Was she withholding evidence? She met his question with the weary calm of one accustomed to suspicion. Some truths, she said, do not belong to policemen. I asked to see her personal notebooks. She hesitated, then opened another drawer. Neat script filled every page, lines unbroken, as though she feared margins. I leafed through until a passage caught me. A crossword clue, copied carefully, then annotated in her hand. 14 across. Keeper of silence, bound by letters, 9. Her penciled answer, librarian. Yet beneath it, written later, another word, confessor. I looked up at her. She lowered her gaze, as if acknowledging the danger of precision. Words reveal more than lives intend. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began to toll the hour. She closed the drawer quietly, with the finality of someone resigning their claim to privacy. I told her we would need the notebooks. She said she understood, but her voice carried a shade of defiance, the kind that grows in those who keep watch over other people's secrets for too long. We left her office, the sound of our steps softened by old carpets. Lewis asked me in the corridor whether I believed her. I said belief was not required, only patience. He shook his head, muttering that patience did not catch murderers. Perhaps not, I replied, but impatience catches only shadows. That evening in my rooms, I studied again the faint imprint on the borrowing slip. Truth will not wait. Yet it had waited, hidden between drawers and silences, until someone chose to listen. I closed my eyes and thought of the librarian, her quiet defiance, her sleeve still marked by rain or tears, or both. Secrets, I reflected, do not perish in water. They surface, sooner or later, like bodies on a river's slow curve. It was Lewis who brought me the fragment, folded carefully inside an evidence bag, as though paper could contaminate truth. He placed it on the desk without a word and waited, his silence louder than any argument. I let it rest there for a while, unwilling to acknowledge the tug of anticipation. Diaries are dangerous things. They pretend to clarity while dissolving into ambiguity. When I opened it, the handwriting was unmistakably his. Narrow, slanted, impatient with margins. The fragment contained no dates, only a brief sequence of sentences, torn mid-thought at both ends. I read them once, twice, each time more uncertain of what they revealed. Cannot trust the circle any longer. Althea's exposure. J writes as though affection absolves her. The records must be hidden, but where? That was all. A half-thought, mutilated, though still pungent with implication. Lewis asked me if I understood who L or J might be. I told him possibilities multiplied faster than truth. He sighed, muttering that I would never grant a straight answer. Straight answers are the refuge of men who prefer walls to doors. We sat together in the narrow lamplight. He wondered aloud whether the fragment confirmed the librarian's complicity. I thought instead of the historian polishing his ring, and of the chaplain's pause before miserere. Each letter of the alphabet has its candidates. What mattered was not initial, but intent. Lewis left at last, weary of my evasions. Alone, I unfolded the fragment again. The word circle troubled me. In Oxford, it could mean a society, a committee, a fellowship. But it also belonged to geometry, to ritual, to crosswords. I reached for the puzzle abandoned on my desk. 6 down. Round body hiding secret centre. 5. I wrote orbit, then crossed it out. Circle. An answer, yes, but also a concealment. A body that protects its silence by moving endlessly about it. The rain had not ceased all evening. It whispered against the window, reminding me of the damp shoes in the wardrobe, of the librarian's sleeve, of the napkin stained like a leaf. Water connects more faithfully than any letter. I thought of J. Jericho, perhaps, or the woman whose hand had written the letter twice read. Affection absolves her, he had written. Did he mean that she believed affection could erase her involvement, or that he feared it might erase his resolve? The ambiguity lingered like perfume after the wearer has left. And L. Lewis, with his blunt loyalty, the librarian with her guarded silences, or someone I had not yet named aloud. He will discover, she had written on the back of her letter. Discover what? Perhaps only that initials rarely keep secrets. Near midnight I walked to the quad. The stones glistened in the lamplight, their reflections fractured by puddles. Students passed, voices raised in laughter, unconcerned with circles, fragments, initials. Their world contained no shadows yet. I envied them their ignorance, though not their certainty. Back in my rooms, I poured a measure and set the fragment beside the glass. Words written in haste have a peculiar power. They confess more by what they leave unsaid. Cannot trust the circle any longer, which suggested that once he had, and records hidden somewhere, records that might unravel the whole neat false solution Lewis had built. I stared at the crossword again. 6 down, still empty. Round body hiding secret centre. Circle, yes, but the hidden centre remained. The whiskey dimmed my vision, blurred the ink, but could not erase the unease. A diary is supposed to be private, yet here it had spoken beyond its owner's death, refusing to let silence triumph. I folded the fragment once more, carefully, though care cannot mend incompletion. Some sentences are condemned to end in mid-air. I extinguished the lamp and listened to the rain sorting Oxford into its secret compartments. There is a peculiar seduction in error repeated. The first false solution leaves one cautious. The second tempts with its polish, its veneer of inevitability. Lewis returned to me one evening with the energy of a man who believes the case has folded into his hands. He spoke quickly, almost triumphantly, as though speed itself might confirm the truth. It was, he insisted, the historian, the grant, the lunch, the nervous fingers grazing his tie. He had both the proximity and the motive. Money, reputation, concealment, all the old levers of crime. I listened while he arranged the facts like books on a shelf. They fitted neatly enough, though the neatness itself unsettled me. I asked him what evidence placed the historian at the river. He frowned, then pointed to the diary fragment. Cannot trust the circle any longer. Surely a fellowship, a committee. The historian sat at its centre, therefore he was the one exposed. It seemed to Lewis a syllogism worthy of Aristotle. Yet syllogisms are only as strong as the words they rest upon, and words, I have found, have a way of loosening themselves from their definitions. He pressed further. The librarian had confirmed the historian's meeting with the deceased. The bursar had whispered of financial improprieties. The circle was fracturing, he said, and the historian feared discovery. There, simple as a nursery rhyme, I did not answer at once. Instead, I studied the crossword left open on my desk. 15 across. History arranged to conceal one's downfall. 9. I toyed with the letters, an anagram of history. I wrote sorority, crossed it out, then thyrosin, nonsense. Finally, authority. Yes, authority concealed, its downfall hidden within the shuffle of history. A clue too obvious, perhaps, but it hummed with a faint pertinence. I told Lewis that authority, once disguised, is difficult to expose. He said he had no time for cryptic diversions, but a crossword setter and a murderer share the same instinct: to hide the truth in plain sight, to mislead by offering an answer too obvious. Later that night, I walked past the historian's lodgings. A thin sliver of light escaped through the curtains, though the rest of the house lay in darkness. I imagined him inside, papers spread, his ring glinting faintly in lamplight. Was he preparing a defence, or merely polishing the relics of his vanity? From the street, the ambiguity looked identical. The next day, Lewis urged me to join him in confronting the man. He rehearsed the lines of interrogation as if performance might secure confession. I agreed to accompany him, though without conviction. We were received in a cramped study lined with books that had not been touched in years. The historian offered us sherry with trembling hands. He answered our questions with a scholar's verbosity, circling around each point until it lost its sharpness. Lewis seized upon one slip. The man said he had last seen the deceased on Tuesday, though we knew from the cafe receipt that their lunch was Wednesday. A contradiction, Lewis declared. Proof. The historian stammered, corrected himself, and perspiration gathered at his brow. It looked like guilt to Lewis. To me, it looked like memory fraying at its edges. We left with nothing tangible, only the weight of suspicion. Lewis walked beside me, satisfied. "There you are," he said. "The circle closes." I told him circles never close. They only continue. He asked if I could never concede. I said I would, once truth refused to move under my feet. Until then, all solutions were rehearsals. That evening, I considered again the diary fragment. Elfia's exposure. Jay writes as though affection absolves her. If the historian were guilty, why not name him plainly? He was no initial. He was already too visible. And affection. No scholar's crime, but something more private, more corrosive. I poured another measure, returned to the crossword. 15 across still waited. Authority. Yes, it fitted. But fit, I reminded myself, is not truth. The neat solution, the apparent confession, the nervous slip of tongue, all as deceptive as a crossword clue, too willing to reveal its secret. Lewis slept that night content, with certainty. I remained awake, listening to the rain scrape the city into fragments. A second false solution may look persuasive, even complete. But completeness, I have learned, is often the most eloquent disguise of all. The photograph emerged from the archive in the manner of all discoveries in Oxford. Reluctantly, wrapped in dust, smelling faintly of disuse and mildew, the archivist passed it across the table without ceremony, as though offering another catalogue slip. Yet in her eyes I detected the faint apprehension of someone who knows the past is never as inert as paper suggests. I studied it under the weak light of the reading lamp. 3 figures stood in front of a building I did not at once recognize. Their clothes placed them 15, perhaps 20 years earlier. The deceased younger, his expression almost careless. Beside him, the librarian, her face already sharpened by discretion, and between them, another man, smiling broadly, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of the deceased. The historian St. Louis leaned over my shoulder, his breath scented faintly with stale tobacco. He said it proved their long acquaintance. I told him proof was a difficult word. It pretends to closure when all it offers is proximity. He frowned and asked what I saw. I pointed to the background. A wall, ivy-covered, but not Oxford. Look at the angle of the stonework, I said. Crete, perhaps. He shrugged. A holiday, a conference, a photograph. I reminded him that photographs are rarely innocent. They arrange, exclude, and reveal by accident. The archivist cleared her throat gently, reminding us that gloves were required. I slipped them on with reluctance. Paper is best understood by skin, not cotton. Still, rules impose their own hierarchies. I asked her where the photograph had been kept. Misfiled, she said, among benefactors' portraits. Misfiled is often the archive's synonym for hidden. We left with a copy, walking back across the quad where rain had begun to fall again. Persistent, fine, settling like ash upon our coats. Lewis remarked that the photograph strengthened the case against the historian. He had been close, perhaps too close, to the deceased. I said closeness is no crime, but his laughter in the picture troubled me. A man rarely laughs so freely in company where he is not secure. That night in my rooms, I placed the photograph beside the diary fragment. Circle, exposure, affection. The faces looked out with the frozen candour of memory, yet between them I sensed currents of silence. The librarian's eyes seemed turned not towards the camera, but towards him. A glance more telling than the ring of stone in the background. I returned to the crossword, abandoned once again at the margin of my desk. 11 down. Picture conceals more than it shows. 5. I considered image, photo, still. I wrote cover, not quite right. Then crypt, yes. A picture can be a crypt, containing not only what is seen, but what is buried. I circled the answer and closed the book. Lewis called the next morning to tell me the bursar had confirmed the conference in Crete some years ago. He insisted the historian had manipulated funds then, and the deceased had learned of it. That, Lewis said, was the motive clear at last. I asked whether the bursar had provided records. He said not yet. Records never arrive when truth requires them. I walked to the archive again. Alone this time. The building smelt of damp cloth and extinguished candles. I asked the archivist if other photographs from the same trip existed. She produced a folder. Most were banal. Groups around tables, landscapes, the ruins of Knossos. Yet one showed only 2 figures, seated on a low wall, their heads inclined close. The deceased and the librarian, the historian absent. Her hand lay on his arm so lightly it might have been erased by a careless touch. But the gesture once seen refused invisibility. I thanked her and left with the image fixed not on paper but in memory. Outside the rain had lifted, and the spires stood out against a pale, reluctant sky. Students hurried by with files pressed to their chests, the present as oblivious to the past as always. That evening, whiskey in hand, I returned to the first photograph. 3 figures, one smiling too broadly, one gazing elsewhere, one unaware that his life would end beside water. Photographs lie by omission. They are fragments pretending to be whole, yet sometimes in the angle of a hand, the shift of an eye, truth flickers like a reflection on a river's surface, elusive, ungraspable, but there. I placed the picture in a drawer, extinguished the lamp, and let darkness resume its guardianship. The porter at the lodge had kept it aside for me, as if the brass itself carried contagion. A key, long and narrow, attached to no label, its teeth worn thin with years of use. He said it had been found in the pocket of the deceased, but not entered into the record at once. Forgotten perhaps or withheld. He would not say which. Lewis eyed it with suspicion. A key without a lock, he muttered, is hardly evidence. I told him every key carries its lock folded within it, waiting for recognition. He smiled grimly and said I had been doing crosswords too long. Perhaps I had. Crosswords and keys are alike. They invite us to believe that all mysteries can be unlocked with sufficient patience, yet most locks corrode and most clues resist. We walked together through the drizzle of an Oxford evening. The street shone like black glass, the lamps wavering in their reflection. Lewis suggested we try the key in the deceased's rooms. The locks there were ordinary, suited to modern convenience. The key was not, its shaft too long, its cut too intricate. An older door awaited it, somewhere deeper in the city. In the study, I examined his desk again. Drawers had been forced, their contents strewn as though chaos might disguise intention. Yet one small drawer in the centre bore a narrow slit, as if for a separate lock once prized open. I tried the key. It refused entry obstinate. Lewis said I was chasing phantoms. I said phantoms often lead more faithfully than facts. Later, alone, I placed the key on my desk beside the crossword. 12 across stared back at me. Opens nothing, conceals everything. 3. I thought of air, sky, lie. Then I wrote key. Too obvious, I told myself, and yet too perfect to erase. The setter had enjoyed the irony of solution without utility. That night I dreamt of doors. Heavy oak, some bearing coats of arms, others blank, their surfaces darkened with centuries of touch. The key hung in my hand, always too small or too large, never right. When I woke, the room was cold, and the whiskey glass half drained. The following morning, I visited the library. The librarian received me with a calm that had long since learned to resist intrusion. I placed the key on her desk. "Does it belong here?" She studied it without expression, then shook her head. Yet the faintest tremor in her hand betrayed something withheld. Lewis asked bluntly if it fitted a safe, a cabinet, a private drawer. She replied only that Oxford contained more locks than it had reasons to secure them. Her eyes, however, wandered to a cupboard in the corner of the room. Ancient oak, its door marked with scratches where metal had once met wood. We tried it when she left for coffee. The key entered smoothly, turned with a reluctant sigh. Inside, nothing of value. Dust, ledgers, receipts bound in ribbon. Lewis cursed under his breath. I bent to examine the shelf. A space, narrow but deliberate, yawned between ledgers. A book removed, then replaced with haste, leaving its companions unsettled. The missing volume might have mattered more than the cupboard itself. When she returned, I thanked her and said nothing. Her gaze lingered on the cupboard, just long enough to confirm what she would not admit. We walked back across the quad. The drizzle had become rain, fine needles against the skin. Lewis asked if I thought the key solved anything. I said it had solved nothing, and perhaps that was its only purpose. He shook his head, weary of my evasions, but he did not throw the key away. That evening I set it once more beside the crossword. 12 across still there, its answer written in my hand. Opens nothing, conceals everything. Key. I closed the book. Some solutions, however neat, remain locked. Confessions do not arrive with trumpets. They slip into the air, almost unnoticed, disguised as anecdote, as fatigue, as a moment when the tongue betrays the caution of the mind. That evening the hall was crowded once more, the smell of gravy and damp wool mingling beneath the hammer beams. The portraits watched, as they always did, indulgent and unsmiling. Lewis and I sat apart. He prefers the plain tables, where talk drifts towards football, cigarettes, the price of beer. I endured high table, where conversation hovers uneasily between gossip and philosophy, never quite belonging to either. The bursar at my side complained of new building works. The chaplain muttered a grace. Even he seemed reluctant to believe. and the historian drank too quickly. His laughter rehearsed. It was the librarian who drew my attention. She sat lower down in the shadows, yet her stillness disturbed me more than the historian's agitation. She spoke little, only nodding when addressed. When the tart was served, she lifted her fork, then set it down untouched, as though appetite had been cancelled by memory. The master, attempting lightness, recalled the deceased with a short anecdote. Something about his pedantry in committee, his insistence on accuracy even in the dullest accounts. The table gave polite laughter too, even to be genuine. I looked down the line. The librarian's eyes closed briefly, not in grief, but in the weariness of hearing a truth diminished to caricature. Later, coffee was served in the senior common room. The chaplain approached me, his limp more pronounced than before. He said in a low voice that sorrow makes liars of us all, and that grace spoken without belief is worse than silence. I asked him why he had paused on Miserere the other night. He replied that some words resist being spoken if one has lately needed them. Then he left me to the fire. It was the historian who supplied the evening's confession. He leaned towards me after his third glass and spoke with the eager confidence of one who mistakes alcohol for courage. He admitted he had quarrelled with the deceased, but only over trifles. Money, perhaps, but money is always a trifle until it is exposed. He said the dead man had threatened to reveal something at the next council meeting, though what precisely he never disclosed. Then, almost as an afterthought, he muttered that the librarian had known more than she pretended, and that her loyalty was dangerous. His eyes flickered away as soon as the words escaped. Lewis caught my glance from across the room. He knew I had heard something, though not its substance. I did not tell him. A confession half-spoken is more valuable than one extracted, for it preserves its ambiguity. On the walk back, the quad slick with rain, I thought again of the librarian's untouched tart, the fork raised, then lowered. In crosswords, omission matters as much as entry. 16 across on the puzzle I had left at home came back to me. Refusal to partake, sign of hidden knowledge. 6. Abstain, a word that can mean both virtue and concealment. In my rooms, I set the historian's muttered words beside the librarian's silence. 2 forms of confession, one drunken, one wordless. Which carried more truth I could not say. I poured a whiskey and watched the rain thread its way down the glass, each line crossing, merging, vanishing into the dark. Lewis telephoned before midnight. He asked if I believed the historian guilty. I said guilt is never so obliging. He asked then if the librarian was protecting him. I said protection and betrayal are sometimes indistinguishable, and he grew quiet, and he grew quiet, and he grew... I returned to the crossword. 16 across, abstain. I filled it in. Yet abstinence is never the end of appetite, merely its disguise. I closed the book, extinguished the light, and let the hall's echo follow me into sleep. Voices strained with laughter, a fork left unused, and one man's words, hurried into the air like a bird escaping through an open window. The key lay on my desk, its brass dulled by time as if knowledge itself had decided to tarnish in silence. Lewis had left it with me reluctantly, muttering that he saw no reason to brood over an object which opened nothing. But I have long believed that the objects which appear least useful are often the ones most eloquent. I turned it over in the lamplight, tracing the teeth with my thumb. Not a door key, too long for that, nor a safe, too finely cut. A cabinet, perhaps. Something old. Oxford hoards such locks in its libraries and archives, guardians of secrets that books pretend to disclose. The room smelt faintly of rain. I'd left the window ajar. From the quad came the echo of footsteps. the laughter of students spilling briefly into the damp night before vanishing again. I thought of their certainty, their eagerness to believe that keys always open doors, and that knowledge, once attained, stays docile in the hand. In the morning I returned to the library, the key heavy in my pocket. The librarian received me with her usual quiet restraint. She asked if progress had been made. I replied that progress was a dangerous word. It implies movement where often there is only repetition. Her glance slid away, but not before betraying the faintest flinch when I placed the key on her desk. She insisted she had never seen it before, yet her fingers brushed the edge of a nearby drawer, not consciously, but with the reflex of familiarity. I noted the gesture and said nothing. Lewis joined me later. He was impatient, restless. He suggested we try the key in every cupboard in the senior common room. We did so under the bemused gaze of a porter. None admitted the key. Lewis declared the whole exercise futile. He said not every riddle had an answer. I told him the trouble is not with riddles, but with solvers who grow weary too soon. That evening, I examined again the torn diary fragment. Records must be hidden, but where? The unfinished sentence seemed now less a lament than an instruction. Records require a lock, and locks require a key. I laid the key upon the fragment and traced the indentations with my pencil. By chance, or perhaps not, the teeth aligned with the gaps in the writing. Absurd, perhaps. But it struck me then that, even in absence, form seeks to match itself. The crossword offered me no consolation. 9 down. Knowledge contained, awaiting release. 7. I hesitated. Capsule, archive, volume. Then I saw it, cabinet. The answer filled the grid with the inevitability of coincidence. I circled it in ink, though the gesture felt less like solution than forewarning. The next day, in a forgotten corridor of the library's basement, I found a tall oak cabinet, dust gathering on its handles, a door warped by damp. The lock, oddly ornate for such utilitarian furniture, seemed to wait for recognition. The key slid in without protest, turned with a dry sigh. The door opened to reveal not treasure but rows of commonplace ledgers. Yet one volume, thicker than the rest, had been returned out of sequence. Inside were pages of notes in the deceased's hand, records of meetings, conversations, fragments of letters copied verbatim, names abbreviated, motives hinted at, but no full story. A circle traced in ink, initials written around it, as though he sought to capture the shape of betrayal itself. Lewis, who had followed me down reluctantly, asked if this was proof at last. I told him proof is never so obliging. What we had found was not conclusion, but aperture. The notes revealed much and confirmed nothing. He swore under his breath, then said perhaps the historian's guilt was here, hidden among the lines. I said perhaps, but my eyes lingered instead on the librarian's name, written once, then crossed through, as if his pen had hesitated at the threshold of disclosure. We locked the cabinet again, leaving dust to resume its guard. Lewis pocketed the key. I did not protest. He believes in evidence, I in the silences that evidence conceals. Back in my rooms that night, I poured a whiskey and studied the crossword grid once more. Cabinet, yes. But cabinets are not solutions. They are only containers. What we had unlocked was not truth, but a deeper maze. I closed the book, let the rain mark its patient rhythm on the glass, and thought how knowledge itself is a key that opens only into further rooms of darkness.